Everyone at Fort Braxton thought it was a joke. A little girl, no taller than a soldier's shoulder, stood in the officers' club with her chin raised and her father's Medal of Honor pinned proudly on her chest. Glasses shook on the tables as laughter rolled through the room, the sound louder than the marching drums of a parade. Colonel Marcus Steele, tall and broad with a cruel gleam in his eyes, leaned forward in his leather chair. He was a man used to commanding respect, used to dismissing people with a single smirk. And now he was smirking at Maya Johnson. Just 12 years old, she stood straighter than any cadet, her small fists clutching an old envelope as if it were armor. She asked only one thing: permission to use the firing range on the anniversary of her father's death to honor his memory the way he taught her. The officers laughed harder. One called her a doll, another told her to go back to school. Their laughter wasn't just mean, it was dismissive, the sound of men who believed their authority was beyond question. But Maya's eyes didn't waver. Her father, Sergeant David Johnson, had once been the best marksman on that very base, a man whispered about even by elite snipers. He had trained her in silence, every weekend, every afternoon after school, before war stole him away forever. And before his last mission, Maya had promised him she would keep training no matter what the world said. She had kept that promise in secret for 3 long years, carrying it like fire inside her. Now facing a room full of men who thought she was nothing, Maya stood calm, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands. She had followed every rule, secured every approval, and presented her request with respect. Colonel Steele mocked her again, calling her stubborn, and then offered a deal meant to humiliate her. 10 shots at 50 meters, with 3 hits required to win her chance. He was certain she would fail, certain she would cry before the first bullet left the barrel. Maya accepted without hesitation. As they left the officers' club and walked toward the firing range, the men whispered bets about how quickly she would break. But none of them knew her secret. None of them had seen the countless mornings she rose at dawn, or the hours she spent holding her breath, steadying her aim, whispering her father's lessons in the quiet of the range. What they thought would be the greatest joke of the year was about to become a story that would echo through the entire base, and far beyond. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the firing range as the group of officers made their way outside, still laughing at the spectacle. To them, this was sport, an easy way to entertain themselves at a child's expense. Major Thompson rubbed his hands in delight, whispering that this would be better than a movie. Captain Williams smirked, already convinced she would cry for her mother after the first shot. Their voices carried, sharp and mocking, but Maya walked a few steps behind, her face calm, her posture firm, as if she hadn't heard a word. Inside, however, she felt the weight of their eyes pressing against her like heavy armor. She remembered her father's words. When they doubt you, breathe. When they laugh at you, listen between your heartbeats. That's where strength is born. At the range, a table of weapons gleamed in the sunlight. Colonel Steele gestured broadly, as if offering her a menu. "Pick your tool for failure, little girl," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'd suggest the smallest one. At least you'll be able to hold it." The laughter followed again, echoing off the concrete walls. But Maya did not flinch. With slow, practiced hands, she touched each weapon as though greeting an old friend, until she stopped at the Glock 19 pistol, the very same model her father had used to teach her when she was just 7. For a moment, silence fell, the weight of her choice stirring something unspoken in the crowd. Steele sneered, pretending interest. "At least you'll fail with style," he said, but even his words sounded thinner now. Sergeant Rodriguez, the range instructor and one of the few men who had truly known her father, stepped forward uneasily. He remembered David Johnson's unmatched precision, the way even the best soldiers sought his advice. Watching Maya handle the weapon stirred an uncomfortable recognition in him. She checked the magazine, cleared the chamber, and tested the trigger with motions so fluid that even seasoned officers blinked in surprise. For the first time, some of the laughter died away, replaced by a nervous hush. Maya closed her eyes, letting the familiar whispers of her father's voice guide her. Feel the wind. Settle your shoulders. The perfect shot waits between your heartbeats. Colonel Steele crossed his arms, masking a flicker of doubt with a smirk. 10 shots. 50 meters. You only need 3 hits, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. But when you fail, and you will, you'll never waste our time with this nonsense again. His voice was sharp, but beneath the bravado was a tension he couldn't quite hide. The air seemed to grow heavier as Maya raised the pistol, her stance steady, her breathing calm. The soldiers, who had come expecting a joke, leaned forward in curiosity. Something about her silence, her unwavering composure, unsettled them. For the first time, it felt less like a game and more like the beginning of something they weren't ready for. The range fell into an uneasy silence as Maya lifted the pistol, her small hands firm but not rigid, every motion echoing lessons carved into her by years of secret training. The laughter had faded into mutters, and even those who still smirked leaned closer, as if pulled by something they couldn't explain. Colonel Steele stood behind her, arms folded across his chest, wearing a smile meant to hide the faintest trace of unease. Around them, the officers whispered bets. 5 misses, 6 at most. Maybe she wouldn't even fire all 10. But none of them knew the hours she had poured into this exact moment. Maya inhaled slowly, closing her eyes for 3 full seconds. In the quiet of her mind, she heard her father's voice as if he were standing right beside her. Breathe, princess. Feel the weight. Respect the weapon, and it will respect you. When her eyes opened, the girl who had walked nervously into the officers' club was gone. In her place stood someone steady, someone who carried a legacy on her shoulders. The command was given. Begin. The first shot cracked through the air, sharp and commanding, cutting the silence like lightning. The recoil jolted her arms slightly, but her stance held steady. A puff of dust lifted from the target. Sergeant Rodriguez lifted his binoculars, his brow tightening. Hit, he muttered under his breath. The second shot came a moment later, perfectly timed with her breathing. Another hit, Rodriguez confirmed, his voice rising. Murmurs rippled through the officers. By the third shot, the laughter was gone. She had already passed the challenge, but Maya wasn't finished. She continued, each pull of the trigger flowing into the next like part of a rhythm only she could hear. By the 7th shot, Steele's smirk had faltered. By the 8th, men who had bet on her failure stood frozen, the sound of their own words choking in their throats. The 9th shot left the range in a silence so heavy that even the flags above them seemed to move slower in the wind. And then came the 10th. Maya adjusted her stance ever so slightly, noticing a faint gust of wind that no one else had even seen. It was the kind of correction only a master would make, subtle yet absolute. She fired, and the final echo rolled across the base like a drum announcing something historic. Calmly, she lowered the pistol, engaged the safety, and faced Steele with eyes steady as stone. 10 shots complete as you ordered, sir, she said, her voice clear and respectful. For the first time in his career, Colonel Steele had no words ready. The certainty he had carried into this moment had shattered. And though the officers around him leaned forward in disbelief, Steele remained frozen, unable to deny the sinking realization that something impossible had just happened before his eyes. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, binoculars pressed to his face, his hands trembling as he tried to steady them. The men around him waited, some whispering nervous jokes they didn't quite believe anymore. Others stood in absolute silence, caught in the strange pull of what they had just witnessed. Rodriguez had seen great shooters in his career, but what he saw now made his stomach tighten. Slowly, he lowered the binoculars, his face pale as if he had glimpsed something beyond reason. "Colonel," he began, his voice dry, almost uncertain. "You should look for—" "Yourself." Steele snatched the binoculars, his movements sharp, impatient, almost desperate. He lifted them and froze. For a moment, his mind refused to process what his eyes told him. All 10 rounds had pierced the target in the exact same place. The bull's eye was not just marked, it was consumed, turned into a single, slightly larger hole, the kind of grouping only whispered about in sniper legends. It was not 3 hits. It was not 5. It was perfection. And it had been achieved not by a battle-hardened veteran, but by a 12-year-old girl he had mocked in front of his men. The crowd reacted in waves. Major Thompson gasped, the binoculars slipping in his hands when he confirmed it for himself. Captain Williams muttered a curse, his face drained of color. A ripple of disbelief spread as one officer after another checked the target, each expression falling into the same pale silence. A few younger soldiers who had slipped in to watch the spectacle stared with wide-eyed awe, their phones quietly recording. Maya stood in the center of it all, her breathing steady, her hands calm, her eyes free of triumph or malice. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She carried the same expression her father had always told her to wear, quiet dignity. For her, this was not about humiliating anyone. It was about keeping a promise. Colonel Steele lowered the binoculars slowly. His lips moved, but no words came. His proud face, once the mask of arrogance, cracked into disbelief. The silence of the range weighed heavier than any explosion, heavier than any battlefield he had ever known. Around him, men who had spent decades in uniform were forced to admit the truth. Their laughter had been the sound of their own downfall. Rodriguez broke the silence. He stepped beside Maya and placed a hand firmly over his chest, his voice carrying so every officer could hear. "Miss Johnson, your father would be the proudest man alive. Today, you did more than honor his memory. You set a new standard for us all." Those words landed like a hammer. They were not meant for Maya alone. They were meant for the men who had laughed, for the colonel who had tried to humiliate her, for the entire system that had doubted her. And in that moment, it was clear that the story of Maya Johnson was no longer just about a girl with a pistol. It was about respect, about prejudice shattered, about a legacy too strong to be ignored. Whispers began to stir across the range, growing like a storm building on the horizon. What had started as a cruel spectacle meant to embarrass a child was now something entirely different. Soldiers leaned into each other, murmuring disbelief, some shaking their heads, others nodding as if they had just witnessed history. The videos recorded on quiet phones would soon spill far beyond the base walls, carrying the sight of a 12-year-old girl humbling decorated officers into the wider world. For the first time, many of these men realized they were part of a story that would not be forgotten. Maya, however, did not bask in the attention. She remained centered, calm, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. When Colonel Steele finally found his voice, it sounded thin and brittle, nothing like the booming authority he was known for. "This must be equipment failure," he muttered. "Some trick." His denial only deepened the silence. Every officer there had seen the precision, had felt the weight of the shots ringing out with surgical control. Steele's excuses crumbled before they even left his mouth. Rodriguez, standing tall beside Maya, raised his voice again. "Colonel, with respect, there's no trick here. What you've seen is the legacy of Sergeant David Johnson, carried in his daughter's hands. We all know his skill, and now we see it reborn." His words carried the ring of authority, and for the first time, Steele's command over the crowd faltered. Eyes that had once laughed now turned to him with something closer to judgment. Then, as if to seal the moment, Maya looked up at Steele directly. Her voice was soft, but cut through the silence with perfect clarity. My father taught me that respect is earned through action, not words. Today, I showed what he taught me. That simple statement struck harder than any bullet. Men who had served for decades stood humbled, not by a superior officer, but by a child whose calm dignity had undone their prejudice. The tension on the range began to shift. Instead of mockery, there was curiosity. Instead of contempt, there was the early spark of respect. Rodriguez turned to Maya once more. "Would you be interested in trying longer distances?" he asked, his tone no longer cautious but openly admiring. Maya's eyes lit with a quiet fire. 200 meters, she replied. Gasps moved through the crowd. Steele's face tightened, fear curling behind his eyes as he realized the spectacle he thought would shame her was only the beginning. As new targets were set up farther downrange, soldiers gathered closer, the energy now entirely changed. They weren't here to see a child fail anymore. They were here to witness something extraordinary. Maya, standing calm with her father's Medal of Honor still on her chest, was no longer the little girl mocked in the officers' club. She was becoming a legend in real time, and everyone present knew it. 6 months had passed since the day Maya Johnson silenced a firing range with 10 flawless shots. What began as whispers across the base had spread like wildfire, crossing state lines, military circles, and eventually the public eye. The grainy phone videos uploaded by young soldiers went viral within days. Little girl humiliates colonel with impossible shooting. Within 2 weeks, the clips had gathered more than 40 million views. News anchors replayed the footage, analysts debated it, and children across the country began whispering her name. What had started as one girl's private promise to her father had become a movement of its own. For Maya, life transformed rapidly. At just 13, she was awarded a gold badge as part of the Army Exceptional Talent Program. Her official title? Junior Precision Marksmanship Instructor. She became the youngest person in U.S. military history to hold such a distinction. Photographs of her standing at the range with recruits twice, even 3 times her age, spread across training manuals, websites, and eventually recruitment campaigns. To her, it wasn't about glory, it was about honoring her father's lessons. But to the wider world, she was living proof that greatness could come from the most unexpected places. Colonel Steele, on the other hand, could not outrun the fallout. Investigations into his conduct unearthed a long trail of discriminatory behavior. Families came forward, recounting stories of dismissal and cruelty under his command. Images of him sneering at Maya circulated widely, his arrogance immortalized in shame. Within months, he was demoted, reassigned to a desolate outpost in Alaska, buried in paperwork under officers who now outranked him, many of whom were men and women of color who had grown up with the very prejudices he embodied. The proud career he had once flaunted was reduced to a cautionary tale. Major Thompson and Captain Williams, the ones who had mocked Maya most loudly, were not spared either. Official reprimands stained their records. Forced into diversity and sensitivity training, their careers limped forward without honor. Their laughter at the officers' club remembered as the background noise to their own downfall. But where others fell, Maya soared. Elite universities offered her scholarships before she had even finished middle school. Defense companies reached out, eager to attach their brands to her name. Letters poured in from across the country. Children in poor neighborhoods, boys and girls who had never thought they could rise above their circumstances. "You make us believe in impossible dreams," one wrote. Black girls especially saw her as a mirror, proof that their worth was not defined by those who doubted them. Through it all, Sergeant Rodriguez remained by her side. Promoted for his fairness and leadership, he became her official mentor, guiding her not only in shooting, but in navigating the weight of becoming a symbol. One afternoon, after a long day of training recruits, he turned to her with quiet pride. "Your father would be so proud," he said softly, "but I think he'd be even prouder of the woman you're becoming." The range itself bore her father's name now. A bronze plaque read, "The David Johnson Range. Excellence grows in unexpected places." Every new recruit who stepped onto that ground was told the story, not as a myth, but as a lesson. Prejudice could blind even seasoned officers, but respect, skill, and courage could break any barrier. And at the center of it all was Maya, a girl who had once stood trembling before a room of laughing men and who had left them speechless with a single promise kept. The story of Maya Johnson had grown far beyond the gates of Fort Braxton. By the time she turned 13, she was no longer just a prodigy on a firing range. She was a symbol of resilience, dignity, and unshakable determination. Journalists called her the girl who redefined respect. Soldiers spoke her name in training halls as an example of humility and excellence. And children who had never believed they could stand tall against the weight of prejudice wrote to her, telling her she had given them courage. Yet in the quiet of her own heart, Maya remained the same girl who rose at dawn to honor a promise whispered at her father's grave. Every Saturday, she still went to that grave, no longer with tears, but with stories, of recruits she trained, of walls she broke, of the lives she touched. She would place her hand on the cool stone and whisper, "I did it, Dad. I showed them what we're capable of." Those visits reminded her that her gift was not just about precision. It was about carrying a legacy with grace, about turning pain into strength, and about showing the world that greatness can bloom in places it least expects. Colonel Steele's name, once a symbol of command, had become a warning whispered in military circles, a reminder of arrogance undone by truth. His attempt to belittle a child had not destroyed her. Instead, it had ignited her rise and transformed the very institution he tried to guard with cruelty. Ironically, he had given her the perfect stage to shine. In interviews, when asked if she resented him, Maya's answer carried wisdom far beyond her years. "He gave me the greatest gift, the chance to prove him wrong. Sometimes our biggest enemies become our best teachers without meaning to." That answer resonated far deeper than the perfect shots she had fired. It was the heart of her story, that true revenge is not about tearing others down, but about rising so high that their doubts no longer matter. The little girl who once asked permission to honor her father had become a young woman whose very presence rewrote the rules of potential and respect. She had turned humiliation into motivation, prejudice into fuel, and underestimation into unstoppable determination. For the soldiers who had once laughed, the lesson lingered like a shadow they could not escape. Real strength does not always wear stripes on its shoulder or medals on its chest. Sometimes it lives quietly in those the world thinks are weakest, until the moment they prove otherwise. And for millions who heard her story, Maya Johnson became more than a legend. She became living proof that courage, dignity, and perseverance can outshoot any prejudice. The story closes not on the sound of gunfire, but on the quiet voice of a young girl who changed everything. The best revenge isn't destroying those who doubted you. The best revenge is becoming undeniable.